The unraveling of Daniel Osborne did not begin with a single dramatic incident that could be isolated and explained away, but rather through a slow and suffocating accumulation of pressure that steadily eroded his sense of stability. What initially appeared to be nothing more than a series of #sent online remarks gradually revealed itself as something far more targeted and persistent, embedding itself into the fabric of his daily life until it became impossible to ignore. At first, Daniel attempted to rationalize what was happening, convincing himself that such hostility was an unfortunate but common aspect of modern life, especially in an environment where anonymity allowed cruelty to flourish without consequence. However, the pattern of the attacks soon made it clear that this was not random behavior, but a deliberate campaign designed to provoke, humiliate, and ultimately destabilize him. The realization of being specifically targeted introduced a deeper level of unease, one that could not be dismissed with logic alone. As this tension intensified, Daniel found himself increasingly unable to separate his external reality from the internal anxiety that had begun to take hold. Everyday interactions became distorted through a lens of suspicion, and even the most ordinary exchanges carried an undercurrent of doubt. Laughter from others no longer felt neutral, while silence itself became oppressive, filled with imagined judgments and unseen observers. The absence of a visible antagonist only amplified this distress, as it deprived Daniel of any clear direction for confrontation or resolution. During this period of growing instability, Jodie Ramsey positioned herself as a source of reassurance, offering guidance that appeared both thoughtful and grounded. She encouraged Daniel to distance himself from the negativity, emphasizing the importance of focusing on meaningful aspects of his life, particularly his relationship with his son. Her calm demeanor and carefully measured advice created the impression of someone genuinely invested in his well-being, allowing her to gain his trust at a moment when he was most vulnerable. What Daniel could not perceive, however, was the profound contradiction at the heart of this dynamic. The same individual who appeared to be guiding him toward recovery was, in reality, responsible for orchestrating the very distress from which he sought relief. This duality transformed every interaction between them into something deeply unsettling, as her words of comfort functioned not as solutions, but as tools to further entrench his dependence on her presence. Such manipulation aligned with broader patterns of concealed influence and psychological control, all a #ED evident within the world of Weatherfield, where hidden motives often operated beneath seemingly supportive relationships. In an effort to regain a sense of normalcy, Daniel turned his attention toward Bertie Osborne, whose innocent desire to spend time with his father provided a temporary anchor amidst the chaos. When Bertie suggested choosing an activity for the day, Daniel seized upon the opportunity to reconnect with something genuine and uncomplicated. The plan to visit the aquarium, accompanied by Ken Barlow, offered a structured escape from the mounting pressure, allowing him to momentarily step outside the psychological strain that had begun to define his experience. For a brief period, this decision seemed to restore a fragile sense of balance, as Daniel focused on fulfilling his role as a father rather than as a target. The simplicity of the plan created the illusion that stability could still be acclaimed through deliberate effort and emotional grounding. However, this sense of control proved to be temporary, as unforeseen circumstances intervened before the day could unfold as intended. Daniel's return home, prompted by a practical necessity, inadvertently exposed him to a new level of public humiliation that marked a significant escalation in the situation. Two individuals, influenced by the same online trend that had been used to target him, replicated the behavior in a physical setting by spraying him with paint. This act was not merely an isolated instance of mischief, but rather a direct extension of the online abuse into the real world, effectively erasing the boundary that had previously allowed Daniel to compartmentalize #S distress. The impact of this incident extended far beyond the immediate shock, as it transformed the nature of the threat he was facing. What had once been confined to digital spaces now manifested in tangible, visible ways, exposing him to ridicule in front of others and reinforcing the perception that he had lost control over how he was perceived. The humiliation was no longer abstract or distant, but immediate and undeniable, embedding itself into his physical reality and amplifying the emotional damage already inflicted. By the time Daniel later found himself at Speed Dale, surrounded by familiar figures including Olia Nazir, Adam Barlow, and Idris, the psychological strain had reached a critical threshold. His perception of the environment had become so distorted that even neutral behavior was interpreted as hostile, and the presence of others no longer provided comfort, but instead intensified his sense of exposure. The situation reached a breaking point when Daniel observed Idris reacting with amusement to footage of the paint incident, an act that symbolized the complete collapse of his remaining emotional restraint. The laughter, whether intended as mockery or not, was perceived as confirmation of his worst fears, triggering an explosive response that shattered the fragile composure he had been struggling to maintain. The act of overturning the table was not merely an impulsive outburst, but the culmination of sustained psychological pressure #E that had been building over time. In that moment, Daniel's reaction reflected a profound loss of control, as the accumulated frustration, humiliation, and helplessness found expression in a single, destructive gesture. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent of this shift, as the social environment around him fell into silence, forcing others to confront the severity of his distress. Outside, removed from the immediate tension of the scene, Adam attempted to de-escalate the situation by engaging Daniel in a more controlled conversation. His approach was grounded in concern rather than judgment, offering Daniel an opportunity to regain composure and reflect on his actions. Daniel's subsea #Quent apology, delivered with apparent sincerity, suggested a momentary recognition of the consequences of his behavior, yet it did not address the underlying cause of his emotional instability. Beneath this surface-level resolution, a more dangerous transformation was taking place. The sense of powerlessness that had defined Daniel's experience began to shift into a desire for control, altering the trajectory of his response to the situation. Rather than seeking to endure or escape the abuse, he became increasingly focused on confronting its source, driven by the belief that direct action was the only means of restoring his sense of agency. This shift culminated in a declaration that fundamentally altered the stakes of the narrative. Daniel expressed a clear and determined intention to identify the individual responsible for the trolling and to ensure that they faced consequences. However, this desire for accountability quickly escalated beyond proportional response, evolving into a fixation on retribution that carried far more severe implications. The statement that he intended to kill the person behind the CKS was not presented as a fleeting expression of anger, but as a calculated conclusion reached after prolonged emotional strain. It signaled a critical turning point in his psychological state, marking the transition from victimhood to potential aggressor. What made this moment particularly tragic was the profound irony embedded within it. While Daniel articulated his determination to eliminate the source of his suffering, he remained entirely unaware that the individual he sought was already embedded within his inner circle. The trust he had placed in Jodie, the reliance he had developed on her guidance, and the emotional vulnerability he had revealed to her all contributed to a situation in which the true threat remained concealed in plain sight. As Daniel stood at the edge of this transformation, consumed by a desire for justice that had begun to blur into something far more dangerous, the narrative set the stage for a confrontation that carried the potential for irreversible consequences. The distance between intention and action had begun to narrow, and with it, the possibility that the unfolding events would lead not to resolution, but to a far darker outcome. In the immediate aftermath of Daniel's outburst, the atmosphere surrounding Daniel Osborne did not settle into calm as one might have expected, but instead grew heavier, more unstable. as though the fragile boundary between control and collapse had already been crossed. Although his apology to Adam Barlow appeared to signal a momentary return to reason, it quickly became evident that the deeper psychological damage remained unresolved, continuing to shape his thoughts in ways he could neither fully articulate nor resist. The experience at Speeddale lingered in Daniel's mind with an intensity that refused to fade, replaying itself not as a singular incident, but as a defining moment that confirmed his worst fears about how he was perceived. The image of laughter, whether intentional or misinterpreted, became inseparable from his sense of identity, reinforcing the belief that he had been reduced to an object of ridicule in the eyes of others. This perception, once internalized, began to influence every subsequent interaction, distorting his understanding of even the most neutral situations. Meanwhile, Jodie Ramsey maintained her carefully constructed role as a source of stability in Daniel's life, continuing to offer reassurance while subtly reinforcing his dependence on her presence. Her approach was measured and deliberate, ensuring that she remained indispensable to him at precisely the moment when his trust in others was beginning to erode. By positioning herself as both confidant and guide, she strengthened the illusion that she was aligned with his interests, even as she remained the hidden architect of his distress. As Daniel's emotional state became increasingly fragile, his reliance on Jodie deepened in ways that extended beyond casual support. He began to interpret her presence as a form of protection, a barrier between himself and the hostility he believed surrounded him. This perception was particularly significant given the broader context of manipulation and concealed intent that often defined relationships within Weatherfield, where individuals who appeared supportive could simultaneously serve as sources of harm. In parallel with this growing dependency, Daniel's connection to Ken Barlow began to shift in subtle but important ways. Ken, who had long functioned as a stabilizing influence, observed the changes in his son with increasing concern, recognizing that Daniel's behavior no longer reflected temporary stress, but rather a deeper and more persistent form of distress. However, the absence of a clear explanation for this transformation made it difficult for Ken to intervene effectively, leaving him in a position of uneasy observation rather than active guidance. This dynamic became particularly evident when Daniel revealed that he had not actually left Weatherfield as he had previously suggested. Instead, he had chosen to remain hidden, withdrawing from the wider community while relying almost entirely on Jodie for emotional support. This decision, while framed as a practical response to his circumstances, underscored the extent to which his world had narrowed, reducing his interactions to a limited cli that was, unbeknownst to him, fundamentally compromised. The implications of this withdrawal extended beyond Daniel's personal well-being, affecting his ability to engage with the broader network of relationships that had previously provided him with balance and perspective. By isolating himself, he inadvertently strengthened Jodie's influence, allowing her to shape his understanding of events without interference or contradiction. This shift represented a critical turning point, as it transformed his vulnerability into a mechanism through which he could be manipulated. For a brief period, however, there appeared to be a possibility that the situation might stabilize. The sudden disappearance of the truth-teller account, accompanied by the deletion of its most damaging content, created the impression that the source of Daniel's distress had been removed. This development offered a tentative sense of closure, suggesting that the campaign against him had come to an end and that he could begin the process of rebuilding his confidence. Motivated by this apparent resolution, Daniel took steps to re-engage with the world around him, organizing a gathering at the bistro in an effort to move forward. The event was intended not only as a social occasion, but also as a symbolic gesture, representing his desire to reclaim control over his narrative and to demonstrate that he was no longer defined by the experiences that had previously overwhelmed him. Yet even as these plans took shape, the underlying instability remained unresolved, waiting for a catalyst that would bring it back to the surface. That catalyst emerged in the form of a seemingly minor inconsistency, a single remark from Jodie that disrupted the fragile sense of certainty Daniel had begun to rebuild. The significance of this moment lay not in the content of the remark itself, but in the context in which it was delivered. For Daniel, whose perception had already been shaped by suspicion and heightened sensitivity, the inconsistency carried disproportionate weight, prompting him to reconsider assumptions he had previously accepted without question. The idea that Jodie might be connected to the truth-teller account, once unthinkable, began to take hold as a possibility that could not be easily dismissed. This realization triggered a rapid and intense shift in Daniel's emotional state, as the trust he had placed in Jodie collided with the emerging suspicion that she might have been deceiving him. The resulting tension was not simply a matter of doubt, but a profound internal conflict that forced him to reconcile two incompatible interpretations of her character. On one hand, she revered in the person who had supported him through his most difficult moments. On the other, she became a potential source of the very harm he had been trying to escape. The confrontation that followed was marked by a level of intensity #T reflected the depth of this conflict. Daniel's accusations, driven by accumulated frustration and fear, extended beyond the immediate suspicion to encompass the full extent of his recent suffering. He attributed his anxiety, his sleeplessness, and his sense of helplessness to Jodie, framing her as the central figure responsible for his deterioration. In response, Jodie denied the accusations, maintaining her position of innocence while simultaneously presenting herself as a victim of Daniel's misplaced anger. Her reaction was carefully calibrated to evoke sympathy, allowing her to exit the situation in a manner that reinforced her credibility while leaving Daniel isolated in his uncertainty. This outcome further destabilized him, as it deprived him of both confirmation and resolution, leaving him suspended between suspicion and doubt. As the evening progressed, the emotional strain continued to build, culminating in a second and more public confrontation at the Rovers. By this point, Daniel's judgment had been significantly impaired by alcohol, which amplified his existing emotions while reducing his capacity for restraint. In this state, he openly accused Jodie of being the person behind the trolling, transforming a private suspicion into a public declaration. The impact of this accusation was immediate and far-reaching, as it not only exposed Daniel's internal turmoil, but also disrupted the social environment in which it occurred. Jodie's reaction, characterized by visible distress, reinforced the perception that she had been unjustly targeted, prompting others to question the validity of Daniel's claims. Her departure from the scene, marked by tears and apparent devastation, further solidified this interpretation, leaving Daniel isolated in the aftermath of his own actions. This sequence of events highlighted the extent to which Daniel's situation had deteriorated, as his attempt to confront the perceived source of his suffering ultimately resulted in further damage to his credibility and relationships. Rather than achieving clarity or resolution, his actions deepened the uncertainty surrounding him, creating additional barriers to understanding and support. At the #me-time, the broader implications of his earlier declaration, that he intended to kill the person responsible for the trolling, began to take on new significance. What had initially appeared as an expression of anger now carried a more concrete and immediate relevance, as Daniel's suspicion shifted toward a specific individual within his immediate circle. The convergence of these elements created a situation of #considerable tension, in which Daniel's emotional instability, his unresolved anger, and his growing suspicion combined to form a volatile foundation for future events. The distance between thought and action continued to narrow, raising the possibility that his desire for retribution might extend beyond words into something far more consequential. Unbeknownst to him, the truth remained just out of reach, concealed behind the very person he had begun to suspect, but could not yet definitively expose. This proximity between intention and reality intensified the sense of impending danger, suggesting that the unfolding narrative was moving toward a point where the consequences of Daniel's actions would become impossible to contain. As the fallout from the confrontation at the Rovers continued to ripple outward, the emotional state of Daniel Osborne did not stabilize, but instead entered a more dangerous phase, one defined not by sudden outbursts, but by a quieter, more focused intensity that suggested his thug HTS had begun to organize themselves around a single, consuming objective. The earlier chaos of confusion and humiliation gradually gave way to something more deliberate, as though Daniel was no longer reacting to events, but preparing for what he believed needed to happen next. In the hours following his public accusation against Jodie Ramsay, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated, not only because of how others perceived his behavior, but also because of the internal shift that had begun to separate him from the people who might otherwise have reached him. The doubt that had once dominated his thinking was being replaced by a growing sense of certainty, and although that certainty lacked concrete proof, it carried enough emotional weight to override any lingering hesitation. This transformation was particularly troubling because it altered the way Daniel processed information. Rather than questioning his assumptions, he began to interpret every detail through the lens of suspicion, reinforcing his belief that Jodie was connected to the abuse he had endured. Small inconsistencies, previously dismissed as insignificant, now up *art as evidence, each one strengthening the narrative he was constructing in his mind. Meanwhile, Jodie's response to the situation remained carefully controlled, allowing her to maintain the appearance of innocence while subtly distancing herself from Daniel. Her withdrawal was not abrupt or confrontational, but gradual and measured, ensuring that it could be interpreted as a natural reaction to being unfairly accused. This approach served to protect her position within the community, while simultaneously leaving Daniel without the reassurance he had come to depend on. The absence of that reassurance had a profound impact on Daniel's emotional stability. Where once he had turned to Jodie for clarity and support, he now found himself alone with his thoughts, forced to confront the possibility that his instincts might be correct, but unable to confirm them. This uncertainty did not weaken his resolve, instead, it intensified his determination, pushing him further toward the conclusion that direct action was the only way to resolve the situation. At the same time, Ken Barlow began to recognize that Daniel's behavior had moved beyond temporary distress into something far more serious. The changes in his son were no longer subtle, as his manner had become increasingly rigid, his tone more controlled, and his focus narrower. Ken understood that such shifts often indicated a deeper internal struggle, one that could lead to irreversible consequences if left unaddressed. In a moment of rare openness, Daniel revealed to Ken that he had never truly left Weatherfield, contradicting earlier claims that he had distanced himself from the situation. This admission was not simply a correction of fact, but an indication of how deeply he had withdrawn from his previous life, choosing instead to remain hidden while he processed what had happened to him. The reliance he had placed on Jodie during this period, now cast in a new light, further complicated the situation, as it suggested that his judgment had been shaped by someone he could no longer trust. Ken's reaction to this revelation was one of quiet alarm, as he began to grasp the extent of Daniel's isolation, and the potential consequences of his current mindset. However, his attempts to guide his son back toward a more balanced perspective were met with resistance, as Daniel's growing conviction left little room for alternative interpretations. The gap between them, once bridged by shared understanding, widened as Daniel moved further into a space defined by suspicion and intent. Where the apparent disappearance of the truth-teller account continued to influence how events were perceived by those around Daniel. For many, its sudden silence suggested that the situation had resolved itself, reinforcing the belief that Daniel's earlier reactions had been #irritated or misplaced. This perception created an additional layer of difficulty for him, as it undermined his credibility and made it more challenging for others to take his concerns seriously. For Daniel, however, the absence of new attacks did not bring relief, but rather heightened his sense of unease. The silence felt unnatural, as though it concealed something rather than resolving it, and this interpretation aligned with his growing suspicion that the person responsible had simply changed tactics. The idea that the threat remained present, albeit in a different form, further justified his belief that he needed to act before the situation escalated again. As this mindset took hold, Daniel's earlier declaration about finding and killing the person behind the trolling began to evolve from an abstract expression of anger into a concrete objective. The emotional intensity that had fueled the statement remained, but it was now accompanied by a level of focus that suggested he was beginning to consider how such an outcome might be achieved. This shift marked a critical escalation in the narrative, as it blurred the distinction between intention and preparation. While Daniel had not yet taken any overt steps toward acting on his thoughts, the direction of his thinking indicated that the possibility could no longer be dismissed as hypothetical. The combination of unresolved trauma, growing certainty, and emotional isolation created a volatile foundation upon which more decisive actions could emerge. Meanwhile, Jodie's position within this dynamic remained precarious, despite her outward composure. Although she had successfully deflected Daniel's accusations in the immediate aftermath, the fact that suspicion had taken root meant that she could no longer rely solely on denial to maintain control of the situation. Her continued proximity to Daniel, once an advantage, now carried the risk of exposure, particularly if he persisted in examining the inconsistencies that had first triggered his doubts. This tension between concealment and discovery added a new dimension to the unfolding events, as both Daniel and Jodie navigated a situation in which their respective goals were fundamentally opposed. Daniel sought truth and retribution, while Jodie sought to preserve her secret and maintain her position. The inevitability of confrontation became increasingly apparent, as the space for ambiguity narrowed and the likelihood of a decisive revelation grew. In the broader context of Weatherfield, where hidden truths and shifting alliances often shape the trajectory of events, this #ping conflict carried significant implications. The potential for Daniel's actions to extend beyond personal resolution into something more destructive aligned with the ongoing atmosphere of instability that had been building across multiple storylines, reinforcing the sense that the situation was part of a larger pattern of escalating tension. As the narrative progressed, the interplay between Daniel's internal transformation and Jodie's concealed actions created a sense of mounting inevitability. Each development brought them closer to a point at which the truth could no longer remain hidden, and the consequences of Daniel's evolving mindset would be forced into the open. The question was no longer whether the situation would escalate, but how far it would go before it reached its breaking point. By the end of this phase, Daniel stood at a crossroads defined not by external circumstances, but by the direction of his own thoughts. The path he had begun to follow was shaped by pain, anger, and a desire for control, and while it offered the promise of resolution, it also carried the risk of irreversible consequences. Unaware of how close he already was to the truth, he continued to move forward, driven by a conviction that, if left unchecked, could transform him from victim into something far more dangerous. By the time the tension surrounding Daniel Osborne reached its next phase, the situation had already evolved beyond a simple conflict of perception into something far more dangerous, where emotional instability, unresolved trauma, and a growing sense of purpose began to merge into a single, relentless drive. The earlier uncertainty that had once clouded his thinking had largely dissipated, replaced by a conviction that, while still lacking definitive proof, felt unshakable to him. This shift in mindset altered not only how Daniel interpreted events, but also how he approached the people around him. Conversations that might once have offered comfort or clarity now felt like obstacles, as though others were either incapable of understanding what he was experiencing or unwilling to acknowledge the truth he believed he had uncovered. The result was a gradual withdrawal from meaningful dialogue, reinforcing his isolation, while simultaneously strengthening his internal narrative. In this state, Daniel's focus on Jodie Ramsay intensified, as she became the central figure around which his suspicions revolved. The earlier ambiguity that had defined his perception of her was replaced by a growing certainty that she was not only connected to the events he had endured, but directly responsible for them. This belief, once tentative, now influenced every interaction, transforming even new troll gestures into potential indicators of guilt. Meanwhile, Jodie continued to maintain her carefully constructed facade, navigating the situation with a level of composure that allowed her to avoid direct confrontation, while subtly reinforcing her innocence. Her ability to remain outwardly unaffected by Daniel's accusations played a crucial role in shaping how others perceived the conflict, as it created a contrast between her apparent stability and his increasingly erratic behavior. This contrast worked in her favor, positioning her as the more credible party in the eyes of those observing from the outside. At the same time, Ken Barlow found himself grappling with the growing distance between himself and his son, recognizing that Daniel's transformation was no longer something that could be addressed through simple reassurance or guidance. The rigidity of Daniel's thinking, combined with his reluctance to consider alternative explanations, made it difficult for Ken to intervene effectively, leaving him in a position where concern could not easily translate into action. This dynamic was further complicated by the lingering effects of the truth-teller account's disappearance, which continued to influence how the situation was perceived within the wider community. For many, the absence of ongoing attacks reinforced the belief that the issue had resolved itself, casting Daniel's continued distress in a more questionable light. This perception not only undermined his credibility, but also contributed to the sense that he was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. However, for Daniel, the silence surrounding the account served as confirmation that something more deliberate was taking place. Rather than interpreting it as an end to the harassment, he viewed it as a strategic pause, a calculated move designed to conceal the truth while allowing suspicion to dissipate. This interpretation aligned seamlessly with his belief that Jodie was involved, as it provided a rationale for why the attacks had stopped at precisely the moment when his focus had begun to shift toward her. As these ideas took root, Daniel's earlier declaration about seeking revenge began to assume a more structured form, evolving from an emotional reaction into a guiding principle that shaped his actions and decisions. The concept of confronting the person responsible was no longer hypothetical, but an objective that he increasingly felt compelled to pursue, regardless of the potential consequences. This progression was particularly significant, because it marked the point at which Daniel's internal struggle began to manifest in ways that could directly impact those around him. His behavior, while not yet overtly aggressive, carried an intensity that suggested a readiness to act if the opportunity presented itself. The line between thought and action, already blurred, continued to fade, raising the possibility that his intentions might soon translate into something tangible. Meanwhile, Jodie's position became increasingly precarious, as the persistence of Daniel's suspicion meant that she could no longer rely solely on denial to maintain control. The risk of exposure, though still uncertain, grew with each interaction, particularly as Daniel's attention to detail intensified, and his willingness to question previously accepted assumptions increased. This shift created a sense of underlying tension, as both individuals navigated a situation in which their respective objectives were fundamentally incompatible. Within this context, even minor interactions carried heightened significance, as they had the potential to either reinforce or challenge Daniel's evolving beliefs. A glance, a hesitation, or an inconsistency could be interpreted as confirmation, while any attempt by Jodie to distance herself risked being seen as an admission of guilt. This delicate balance made the situation increasingly volatile, as it reduced the margin for error and heightened the likelihood of a decisive confrontation. As all of this was happening, the broader environment of Weatherfield continued to reflect a pattern of concealed truths and escalating tensions, reinforcing the idea that Daniel's situation was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger narrative in which hidden motives and delayed revelations often led to dramatic consequences. The convergence of these elements created a sense that the current trajectory was leading toward a critical turning point, one that would force the truth into the open regardless of the consequences. For Daniel, this growing sense of inevitability only strengthened his resolve, as he became increasingly convinced that he was on the verge of uncovering the reality behind the events that had consumed him. The emotional intensity that had once driven his reactions was now accompanied by a level of focus that suggested he was preparing himself for what he believed would be a decisive moment. By the end of this phase, the situation had reached a point where the possibility of de-escalation seemed increasingly remote. The combination of Daniel's unwavering conviction, Jodie's continued deception, and the lack of external intervention created a scenario in which the tension could only continue to build. The narrative had moved beyond uncertainty into a space defined by anticipation, where the question was no longer whether the truth would #urge, but how much damage would be done when it finally did. As the pressure surrounding Daniel Osborne reached its most critical point, the situation could no longer be contained within internal conflict or unresolved suspicion, as every element that had been building beneath the surface now converged into a single trajectory that pointed toward inevitable consequences. What had once been a fragmented emotional struggle had solidified into a clear, albeit dangerous, sense of purpose, shaping Daniel's perception of both the past and the immediate future. The transformation within him was no longer subtle or ambiguous, as his behavior began to reflect a level of determination that left little room for hesitation. The uncertainty that had previously defined his interactions with Jodie Ramsay had been replaced by a conviction that, regardless of proof, felt absolute. This shift created a scenario in which Daniel no longer sought reassurance or validation from others, but instead relied entirely on his own interpretation of events, reinforcing the isolation that had already taken hold. Within this mindset, the idea of confronting the truth became inseparable from the desire to reclaim control over his life, leading Daniel to view any potential exposure of Jodie's actions as both necessary and justified. However, the emotional intensity driving this belief continued to blur the boundary between justice and retribution, raising the possibility that his actions, if left unchecked, could extend beyond confrontation into something far more destructive. Meanwhile, Jodie's position grew increasingly unstable, as the persistence of Daniel's suspicion made it clear that her ability to maintain control over the situation was diminishing. Although she continued to present herself as composed and unaffected, the growing focus on her behavior meant that even minor inconsistencies carried the risk of being interpreted as confirmation of guilt. This shift created a sense of urgency, as the balance she had carefully maintained began to falter under the weight of Daniel's scrutiny. At the same time, the broader perception of events within Weatherfield remained divided, as those observing from the outside struggled to reconcile Daniel's escalating behavior with the apparent absence of any ongoing threat. The silence of the truth-teller account continued to shape this perspective, reinforcing the belief that the situation had already resolved itself, and casting doubt on Daniel's continued fixation. This disconnect between Daniel's internal reality and the external interpretation of events further isolated him, reducing the likelihood that others would intervene in a meaningful way. In parallel, Ken Barlow remained deeply concerned about the trajectory of his son's actions, recognizing that the intensity of Daniel's conviction left little room for influence or guidance. Ken's attempts to engage with Daniel were met with a hashtag assistance, as the younger man's focus had narrowed to such an tent that alternative perspectives were no longer considered relevant. This growing divide underscored the severity of the situation, as it highlighted the absence of any stabilizing force capable of redirecting Daniel's path. As the narrative approached its tipping point, the earlier declaration that Daniel intended to kill the person responsible for the trolling began to carry an even greater weight, as it now existed within a context where the target of his suspicion had become more clearly defined. The shift from abstract anger to a focused objective transformed the statementee from a moment of #onal release into a genuine threat, one that could no longer be dismissed as hyperbole. This development introduced a heightened sense of danger, as it suggested that the convergence of Daniel's emotional instability, his growing certainty, and his lack of external support could lead to actions with irreversible consequences. The distance between intention and execution, already reduced by the events that had unfolded, now appeared alarmingly small, raising the possibility that a single triggering moment could push Daniel beyond the point of restraint. Meanwhile, Jodie's continued presence within his immediate environment ensured that the tension remained constant, as every interaction carried the potential to escalate the situation further. The proximity between them, once a source of comfort for Daniel, had become a catalyst for suspicion, transforming even routine encounters into moments charged with underlying hostility. This dynamic reinforced the inevitability of a direct confrontation, as neither party could fully disengage without drawing further attention to themselves. Within the broader context of Weatherfield's ongoing atmosphere of concealed truths and escalating conflicts, this situation aligned with a pattern in which hidden actions inevitably surfaced, often with devastating consequences. The interplay between secrecy and revelation, already a defining characteristic of the environment, suggested that the truth behind the truth-teller account would not remain hidden indefinitely, and that its exposure would carry significant repercussions for all involved. As the final phase of this storyline approached, the emotional and psychological trajectory of Daniel's character reached a critical threshold, where the potential for redemption existed alongside the equally strong possibility of irreversible damage. The choices he made in the moments to come would determine not only the outcome of his conflict with Jodie, but also the extent to which he would be able to reclaim the identity that had been gradually eroded by the events he had endured. At its core, this narrative was no longer solely about the impact of online abuse, but about the transformation it had triggered within Daniel, revealing how sustained psychological pressure could alter perception, reshape priorities, and ultimately push an individual toward actions they might once have considered unthinkable. The tension between truth and illusion, trust and betrayal, victimhood and aggression had reached its peak, leaving the outcome uncertain, but undeniably consequential. With Daniel now fully convinced that he stood on the brink of uncovering the truth, and with Jodie's carefully constructed deception beginning to show signs of strain, the stage was set for a resolution that would not only expose hidden realities, but also test the limits of how far Daniel was willing to go in pursuit of justice.